Okay, since Google owns Firebase, this kind of makes it very easy because you can log into Firebase with your Google credentials and you can start to create a new project just like that. So we'll name this project iOS Login, and we're going to create the project, and that's going to take a few seconds. And then it's going to give you some instructions. So in the meantime, we're going to create a single view application. We'll name it iOS Login. And you notice that my organization identifier is codechamp.com. And this is because I have a new website and it's called codechamp.com. Now, in this tutorial, I'm going to create a Git repository on the Mac because I want to upload this tutorial to GitHub. So let's go back to the Firebase console and let's follow the instructions. So I'm going to copy the bundle identifier and just paste it in. So that's like part 1. And I'm going to click on register app. Then I'm going to download the Google services -info.plist, and I'm going to place this in the root of my project. Okay, I would just like to mention that this tutorial can be found on codechamp.com, and all of my future tutorials can be found on codechamp.com as well. Okay, now you're still going to have to visit the site anyway because you're going to need to get some files to use in this tutorial. Okay, so at this point I have placed the Google services -info.plist in my root file, and now I'm going to open a terminal and I'm going to navigate to my project directory. Okay, now my project directory, well, my project folder, the name of it is iOS Login, and it has in a space. So when you're trying to navigate to those directories using the terminal, you have to use a backslash. So it's cd iOS /login. So you navigate to that folder and you type the command pod init. And when you type that command, it's going to create, well, it's going to allow you to use Cocoapods. And Cocoapods, in my opinion, are really cool. Okay, they add a lot of functionality to your apps. Okay, so after we type pod init, we are going to open that pod file, and we're going to use a command to open that pod file, and we're going to type we're going to type open pod file -a Xcode, and this is going to open the pod file with Xcode, and we're going to uncomment the second line because we're using iOS 9.0, and we're going to add Firebase, and we're also going to add Firebase Authentication. So we're going to save that, and then we are going to install these pods into our project. Now when it's finished installing, it's going to create another Xcode project, and you're going to be able to tell between the original Xcode project and the newly created one, because the newly created one is going to be white and the old one is going to be black. So when this is finished installing, we are going to open the Xcode project that has the pods installed. Okay, and when you open it, just hit product and go to build, and then you're ready to begin. In this part of the app, we're going to be working on the user interface. Now, before I go any further, I have to give credit to appicon.co because I use this website to generate all of the images that I'm going to be using in this tutorial. So you can give that site a visit, or you can visit my website and you can download all of these images that were used in the creation of this app. Okay, so once we have dragged all of the images into the assets folder, we need to create a navigation controller by going to editor and clicking on embed in navigation controller. Now, a navigation controller is responsible for managing a stack of view controllers, okay, and they're very easy to implement. Okay, and after you've done that, I want you to drag an image view onto the screen, and we're going to pin it 0 pixels from the leading, trailing, top and bottom edges, and we're going to change the image to that welcome screen, and we're going to choose aspect fill. Here I'm going to do a little bit of house cleaning. I'm going to rename my view controller to welcome view controller. So I'm going to go into the Swift file and I'm going to simply rename my class welcome view controller. I'm going to go up here and I'm also going to rename it welcome view controller. Okay, now I'm going to run the app to see if it works. Now, it's a very good programming practice to build in small stages and tests, because it allows you to see, like if you run into problems, they can be easily corrected. Now, what I want you to do is drag a button onto the screen, and I want you to change the color of the button to white, change the text to login, and change the font to Helvetica New, change it to thin, and set the size to 50. Okay, and I'm just gonna drag the button view up, and I'm going to open the assistant editor. Now you notice that it's not coming up, so sometimes you have to select it. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want my buttons to be rounded and I want them to have a border. So what I'm going to do is create an outlet, and then I'm going to go into the view did load method, and I'm going to adjust the layer of the button. So I'm going to give it a border width of 2. I'm also going to give it a corner radius of 10, and I am going to set the color of the border to white. Now, you will not be able to see these in the storyboards, but once you run the app, you should be able to see these changes. Okay, I'm just going to do a little bit of house cleaning. I'm going to go into the identity inspector and make sure the name is set to welcome view controller, and make sure the module is set to iOS login, because you want to inherit that module from the target. Okay, so I'm going to test the app, and we can see that we have the login button, and it has has a white border with rounded corners. So I'm just going to duplicate that button, and I'm going to rename it to register. And I'm going to do the same thing as before. I'm going to open up the assistant editor, and I'm going to create an outlet for that button as well. And I'm going to name it register button and hit connect. And I'm going to copy the same properties that I have for the login button for the register button, and you will only be able to see these properties during, well, these effects during runtime. So once this is done, I am going to test and run the app to see if everything looks good. But before I do that, I'm going to place these buttons inside of a stat view. I'm going to position it horizontally in the container, and then I'm going to pin it from the view. It's going to be 30 pixels from the leading edge, 30 pixels from the trailing edge, and it's going to be 45 pixels from the bottom edge. And I'm going to give it a height of about 150 and add these 4 constraints. I'm going to set the distribution to fill equally. This is the distribution for the stack view, and I'm going to give it a spacing of about 20 pixels. And now I'm going to run the app to see how it looks. And it seems like our buttons are not really filling up the entire stack view. Okay, so this was my problem. Instead of calling that register button, I called it login button. And I'm going to select the stack view and make sure that my alignment is set to fill. Okay, now I'm going to run the app and see how that looks. Okay, great, it looks really good. So now we need to work on our login view controllers and the register view controller. Okay, so I'm going to give myself some room, and I'm going to drag a new view controller onto the screen. And we need to create a new Swift file, a new CocoaTouch class file actually. I will call this one login view controller and click next. And make sure it targets iOS login. Okay, so let's go back to the main storyboard. We're going to click on the view controller that we just created, and then we're going to go to the class inspector. Sorry, it's called the identity inspector, and we're going to make sure that the class is login view controller and the module is iOS login. Now we're going to control and drag from the button to the new view controller that we just created to create a segue. And we're going to select show, so that when we click on the login button, it's going to go to the next, well, the view controller that we just created. Okay, just drag a view controller just as before. We'll create a new class just as before, call it register view controller. Okay. Okay, and then we're going to go into the identity inspector and make sure we have register view controller. And then we're going to create a segue from the register button to the new view controller that we just created. And we're going to give that, okay, and we're going to drag on two image views. And we're going to pin them 0 pixels from the top, leading, trailing, and bottom edges. And for the image, for the login, we're going to use the login image, and for the register screen, we're going to use the register image. Just test and run the app when you're finished to see how it looks. So when I hit the login screen, it goes to the login. Great. So it's working as expected. Now let's look for some text fields. And let's drag these onto the first view controller. Okay, for the content type, choose email. We want to turn off the correction. And let's change the font type to Helvetica New, then set the font size to 20, hit done, and let's give it some placeholder text. Enter your email. Now we're going to duplicate this by holding down the Option key and dragging, and this here is going to be the text field for our password. So we're just going to change the placeholder, we are going to change the content type to password, and we are going to use secure text entry. Okay, and we're going to put the two of these, we're going to embed them in a stack view, and we're going to position it horizontally in the container, and we are going to pin it, well, we want to pin it to the top, so make sure that you are pinning it to the view and not the safe area. So it's going to be 120 from the top, 30 from the leading, and 30 from the trailing. Okay, and we're going to give it a height of 150 pixels, and we're going to add these 4 constraints. For the distribution, we are going to set it to fill equally, so we make sure that the stack view is selected, and we're going to give it spacing of about 25. Great. We're next going to work on that login button, so just drag a button onto the screen and customize it to suit your taste. So I'm going to use Helvetica New, and I am going to change the font size to 35. I'm going to change the text color to white, and for the background I'm going to use 20374F, and I'm going to set the opacity to 35%. I'm going to pin it horizontally in the container. I'm going to add that constraint, and then I'm going to give it a height of 50 pixels, and I'm going to pin it 30 pixels from the leading and trailing edges of the view. Okay, I'm also going to pin it 90 pixels from the bottom of the view. Okay, and I'll go into my assistant editor, and I am going to create an outlet for this button because I want this button to have a rounded border, and I also want it to have, I also want the border to have a color as well. So I'm just going to copy the code from the very first view controller. Okay, and do not forget to name your button login. Clearly, I forgot to name my button login. Okay, so I'm just going to run the app and see how it looks. Great. Okay, like I said before, the register screen is basically a carbon copy of the login screen, so I'll just show you it that you see that it works. We need to enable email authentication for the Firebase app. So go to the console and click on authentication and choose set up the sign-in method, and we want to select email or password. Okay, and once you've finished doing that, head over to Xcode and open appdelegate.swift, and you want to import Firebase, and in the did finish launching with options, you want to type Firebase app.configure. Now in the past this was for app.configure, so it seems to change very frequently. Okay, so let's work on the login view controller first. Let's create an outlet for the email text field and an outlet for the password text field by control and drag into the login view controller.swift. Let's delete all of those comments, and let's control and drag from the button to the code, and let's create an IB action. And when you're done, just hit connect, and let's do the same thing for the register view controller. So we need two outlets for the email text field and the password text field, and for the register we need an IB action just as before. And hit connect when you're done. Now it seems like I've made a mistake here. Instead of making an action, I created an outlet. So this is a problem that can be easily fixed. You can go into the connections inspector and you can delete the connection, and then you can delete the code, because if you don't do that, you're going to run into some errors. Okay, so I will create an action. I'm going to call it login button press, and I'm going to hit connect. Okay, now we're going to work on the register view controller first. So import Firebase, and in the IB action for the register button, start typing auth to tap into the Firebase authentication class, and hit period to select the authentication object, and use dot notation to use the method create user with email and password. Now this method is going to require an email of type string, a password of type string, and we will use the text fields on the register view controller. Now they will have to be optionals. Now select the off callback and hit enter. Then type user error in the placeholders. Now in this part here, we're going to use a if statement, and basically if the error is is not nil, is going to print the error, and if that is not the case, it's going to print registration is successful. I don't know, it's a little confusing because it's like using double negatives. We're going to test and run this app, and we're going to use the email address user@codechamp.com. Now if you navigate back to the Firebase console and you click on the authentication tab and you look for users, you should be able to see that user right there, and it was created January 19th, which was yesterday. Yes. Once the user is registered, we don't want to stay right there. We don't want to stay on that screen, so we need to fix that problem. So that means that we need to add another view controller to the screen. So I'm going to call this view controller the main view controller, and I'm going to create a Swift file, and I'm going to call it main view controller. And I'm also going to add a logout button to this view controller. So when the user is ready to log out, we click on this button and it's going to take you back to the start screen. Okay, so I'm just going to create a segue, which is called, I'm going to call it go to main. So that means I'm going to give it the identifier go to main. So I'm going to select this blue button here in the register view controller and control and drag to the main view controller and create my segue. And the identifier, like I said, is going to be go to main. Okay, now in order to get to this, in order to get to that view controller, we need to call this method perform segue with identifier, and we're going to pass in the name of the identifier, and the sender is going to be self. Now since we are inside of a closure, we have to use the self keyword. Okay, so add a button to the screen, change the font to Helvetica New, make it thin and give it a font size of 35. Position it horizontally in the container. Make sure you change the text to logout. And go into the pin menu and let's pin it 30 pixels from the leading edge, 30 pixels from the trailing edge, and from the bottom view we're going to set it to 90 pixels from the bottom view. We're going to give it a height of about 50 pixels, and we're going to add these 4 constraints. Okay, over open up the assistant editor and control and drag from the logout button to the bottom of our code and make sure that we are making an IV action, and we're going to call this one logout button pressed, and we're going to make the connection. Make sure that you import Firebase, and this sign out method or logout method is probably the most difficult part of implementing email sign out, sign in with Firebase. The reason why it's most difficult is because it throws an error and it has to be placed inside of a do catch block. So it's basically going to try to sign out of the app, and if it can't sign out, it's going to print there was a problem signing out. And if it's able to do that, it is going to go back to the root view controller, because we're using that method pop to root view controller, and we're going to set the animation to true. And I probably shouldn't have said that this is the most difficult method. I should have said that this is more difficult than the, well, technically speaking, it'll be most difficult because we're comparing three, but it's more difficult than the other two because the other two methods seem to be of equal difficulty. If you look carefully, you'll notice that I do not have a space between the equal sign and nil on line 34. So I just need to add a space there, and it seems like I'm missing a curly brace. And great, my code is finished. Well, for the logout button. Okay, so let's just test and run the app. So I'm going to register. I'm going to say victor@codechamp.com. Just give it some random password that's at least 6 characters long. And I'm going to hit login and logout. Okay, so it seems to be working. So there's just one more section that I need to code up, and that is the logging view controller. But before we go there, just take a look at the users. So we have 2 users now. So I'm going to go to the login view controller, and it's basically the same thing as before. So I'm just going to create a segue, and I'm going to give it the identifier of go to chat and hit enter. And I'm going to go to login view controller, make sure that I have imported Firebase. And if you don't import Firebase, you're going to get an error. Import Firebase, and this method that we're going to use right here is very similar to the method used in the register view controller. The only difference is instead of create user with email and password, we are going to sign in a user with email and password. So I'm basically just going to copy the code from the register view controller, and then I'm going to test and run this app to see if it works. Now, if you enjoyed this tutorial, you can give me a thumbs up, and you can also visit my website where you will find this tutorial. On the website, it's broken down into 3 parts, and the name of that website is codechamp.com. Now, when you don't see me on YouTube, it probably means that I'm busy working on this website because it's a new website, so it's gonna require a lot of work, and I'm also working to teach code to 9 and 10-year-olds at the school where I work. Okay, so that's one of the projects I do at that school, and we're also working on building an electric go-kart for the science fair. So please don't think that I've abandoned you, but I'm usually a very, very busy guy. And I'd just like to say thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial.